Okay, well, good morning. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us. My name's Sasha. I'm just going to quickly do a few housekeeping things before we start for the morning. So I'd just like to remind everyone that these sessions are going to be recorded. So we do ask that you please keep your camera off and your microphone muted unless you are asking a question during a Q&A segment. And if you would like to ask a question with your camera off, that's also absolutely fine as well. Speaking of questions, we do have a chat function at the bottom of Zoom. So at the very bottom of your Zoom, there will be a button that says chat, which you're very welcome to post questions in throughout the presentations during the day. And those will be the ones that we will refer to throughout the Q&A section. Okay, I'm going to hand over to Sophie Bickford, our Executive Director from Biolinks Alliance.
Good morning, everybody. Lots of familiar names there and lots of new names. Lovely to have you all. Thanks for making it along to our, it's our 6th annual symposium and the second that we've had to hold as a digital event. We'd hoped this event would be in person this year, of course, but we're still happy to be here with you all virtually, all the same. Before anything else, I want to start with an acknowledgement of country. Biolinks Alliance is proud to acknowledge the traditional owners of the places we work and live. We recognise and respect the enduring and deep relationship they have with their lands and water, and we pay our respects to elders past, present and future. Just want to do a very brief introduction to the Leaky Landscapes topic and why we've landed on it and why we think it's important and have dedicated a symposia to it. It's an important topic today and it's coming at a critical time. It's become very apparent that a rapid scaling up of the repair of landscapes to restore functional ecosystems that can buffer us from the worst effects of climate change, can halt species extinctions and can even stave off the next pandemic is absolutely critical. And this is the decade that we must do it. Over 80 countries have accepted targets for restoration and conservation of 30% of terrestrial ecosystems by 2030. So this is the scale of the challenge that we must meet. So this symposium is focusing on fixing the foundations, water and soil, the master inputs to a functioning and healthy landscape and ecosystems. And we're seeking ways to learn and work with nature to do the fixing. So functional approaches to repair are equally important in bushland and agricultural settings. And practitioners in both spheres have been figuring out how to do it and have much to share and learn from each other. And so we're combining the two, which aren't often combined, into this program today. So this morning's session, we're going to have 5 keynotes addresses. We'll have 2 sessions this morning. We're pairing our speakers. The first 2 will be speaking about the conceptual frameworks of leaky landscapes from primarily from hydrological and soils perspectives. And then the keynotes in the second sessions will be looking at issues of landscape function and dysfunction from more of an ecological perspective. We'll then break for lunch before hearing the last of our keynote speakers, who will provide some international perspectives on where regenerative agricultural practices are being harnessed to affect ecosystem repair. Not all of you are going to be probably with us all day, so I just want to acknowledge and do some thank yous at the start of the event. There's a few people that, that I really like to point out and thank for making this event possible. Paul Foreman and Jon Fawcett. Paul's an ecologist with Biolinks Alliance, and Jon, we've been working with closely, have their ideas and hard work have brought this program together, and it wouldn't be what it is without those two. And I want to thank Sasha for her supreme event production skills. And I also especially want to acknowledge and thank our generous sponsors who have made today possible: the Ross Trust, City of Greater Bendigo, and the Pool of Dreams, who enabled us to sort of pivot to an online symposium format last year. Thank you thank you all for your support for supporting the Alliance's knowledge sharing and landscape repair programs. So the first section in the program today is a keynote by Dr. David Tongway, AM, titled The Application of Landscape Functional Analysis, LFA, to the Restoration of Disturbed Landscapes. We're absolutely honoured to have David open the symposium for us. I'll just give you a little bit of David's background. David originally hailed from the Bendigo region, and he trained as a metallurgical chemist at Bendigo School of Mines. He joined CSIRO in 1966 and before long was working in the New Rangelands Research Group, working closely with scientists from the then very strong CSIRO Soils Division, which doesn't exist anymore. From the 1970s, he began concentrating on soil health, and he found the area to be somewhat under-researched and subjective, and it led him to develop landscape function analysis, a seminal framework for thinking about how landscapes function that can be extremely useful for assessing dysfunction and figuring out ways to repair them. His work has influenced many in the field of ecosystem restoration and regenerative agriculture, and we're extremely privileged to have David give his presentation and take questions from us today.
Okay, so David doesn't have presentation facilities at his house, so we've actually pre-recorded this session, but he will be joining us via phone a little later on this morning to answer some questions. So yeah, let's just get straight into his presentation. Just one moment. Okay, I'm hoping everyone can see that.
Good afternoon, everybody. I'd like to deliver this presentation about the application of landscape function to the restoration of disturbed landscapes. And in the opening slide, there are examples of the same landscape type. What the picture on the right shows a landscape which has been highly disturbed. Now going to slide 2, which shows the presentation outline. There's 4 points I'd like to make throughout this talk, which is what is landscape function? I'll be attempting to describe the way I've developed that since about 1980. Secondly, how can it be used to assess dysfunction? How dysfunctional is a landscape? Thirdly, how can that knowledge of dysfunction lead to the selection of appropriate rehabilitation technologies? And finally, with rehabilitation being on the go, how do we know when we've done enough? I'm now going to slide 3, which shows a map of Australia with a soils map in the background, showing all the places on the ground in Australia where I both developed and implemented this landscape. Going now to slide 4, the history of this project was that we began about 1975 working on what was called rangeland condition, in which was a very strong US-Australia connection. Both the US rangelands and the Australian rangelands were opened up at the same time in the mid-19th century. And as a consequence, we've had an association with the people working in USA. The received wisdom we had in 1975 was that any assessment of range condition was highly industry orientated and both subjective and arguable. And there were many friendships lost over arguing about whether a landscape was in good, fair, excellent or poor condition. By 1977, a colleague of mine called for range condition to be expressed in terms of soil productivity and be represented by a verifiable numerical system. He visited Australia and we rejected species composition as all we needed to know and began to collect our field data in a spatially explicit manner using runoff water direction and vegetation pattern as the linking observing principles. About the same time, we had a new chief come to our CSIRO division with Southern African experience, and he summed up the objective of what we were trying to do. And I've written it here: we need to develop a predictive understanding of our lands under management. And those words have resonated with me ever since that time. I'm now going to slide 5. So the subsequent work I did with Dr. John Ludwig, we developed linked and integrated measures of the slope, the soil, and the vegetation, which together explain how our landscapes work as biophysical systems. And this became the LFA field methodology. Prior to this, much of the work was done with a plant community basis, which didn't really give you any idea of predictability. So we're able to deploy these measures across the spectrum from near pristine to highly disturbed versions of the same basic landscape type. And our method enabled us to be able to discriminate the range of conditions between the worst and the best. Subsequent work looked at different types of landscapes, grasslands, woodlands, forests, etc. And we drew together all of those principles in a book our group published in 1997. There's an image of it there, and I provided a digital copy to the organisers to give to anybody interested. There are no longer any hard copies available. I'm now going to slide 6, which shows two images. The image on the right is looking directly down a very low slope and identifies a bare crusted soil which tends to run water off very smoothly. And you can see that the water runs into that dense grassland just upslope of a tree grove. So this is a repeatable pattern, and you might be able to see between the trees the next elements of pattern further down slope. So we were able to, by observing this, we're able to deduce that this landscape worked by having a certain amount of resources run off the bare slopes, being captured by the dense grassland and then shared amongst the trees. The right-hand picture shows the same landscape type in the same paddock, but much closer to a watering point where domestic stock, wild animals and feral animals all had access to water. And you can see that that pattern has completely disappeared. It's become what we call dysfunctional, so that vital resources, water, topsoil, seeds and organic matter flowed rapidly off the landscape. So our notion at this stage was that it is the economy of natural capital which is the appropriate metaphor for understanding landscape function. I'm now going to slide 7, which is the first of a stepped procedure to show you how we make our observations at a new landscape. The first thing we do is to look at the trigger of rainfall. What happens to rainfall after it falls on the ground? And what this diagram shows here is you can divide it conveniently into outflow water which leaves that landscape and infiltration which recharges the soil. So this point makes the very important point that water is the master input. It's the first thing we need to know when we study a new landscape. I'm now going to slide 8, which shows what other things happen with these water transfer processes. So the outflow can take soil as well as water, and that leads us to this notion of landscape leakiness, where you may leak the water and or topsoil and organic matter completely off that landscape altogether. The other thing to be aware of is that the water which enters the soil profile triggers all sorts of biological processes, including many of the below ground processes which we can't see, but as scientists we can measure them, which are going on at all scales in the soil. I'm now going to slide 9, which shows that one of the major outcomes of rainfall infiltrating the soil is that there is a pulse of growth, which most of us will see in terms of above ground growth, but there will be considerable below ground growth as well. This diagram adds what we call off-take processes, would be grazing animals, eating the grass and so on, fires which may burn the grass as fuel, and storms which may redistribute resources by wind. Going now to slide 10, this completes our stepwise process of looking at the landscape, where we look at the positive side of feedback, the biological processes which come out of the growth pulse, feeding back by, for example, nutrient cycling back into the soil reserves so that we retain nutrients in the soil ready for the next population of plants to come and use. The second thing that we get out of the growth pulse is the presence of the plant species in the system, which will be controlling the physical processes of runoff and run on. I'm now going to slide 11. So that's what I've just explained is the basis, or the theoretical basis of LFA. Now, when we're doing LFA, we collect data at two scales. One is a broader scale, or the hill slope scale, where we're looking at the landscape from the top of the local watershed down to a drainage line at the bottom, where the movement or absorption of scarce vital resources is recorded on grad sects. Now, grad sects is a made-up word, short for gradient-oriented transect. That is, in the gradients we're looking at is mainly the slope, and it reflects the manner in which water runs out of or along the landscape. And in doing that, we recognise in that landscape patches where resources tend to be retained, and interpatches where the resources tend to be free to flow across the landscape and maybe out at the bottom. And at the finer scale, we look at within the patch, and we have devised 11 soil surface indicators, which are assessed typically on a 1 metre mini transect within the major grad sect. Each of those indicators refers to a biophysical process, not to the presence or absence of any particular biota. A manual explaining all the indicators with illustrations is available free to anyone interested. And if any of the audience are interested, the best thing is to contact me by email and I can tell them all about it. And now going to slide 12, which shows two pictures of a bladder saltbush community in Western New South Wales. The picture on the left shows a grazed landscape, which has been quite conservatively grazed for perhaps 100 years or so, whereas the picture on the right shows the same landscape type only a few metres away, which has been protected with a tall fence from all grazing animals, the domestics, the wilds and the ferals. And you can see in the left-hand picture that there's a lot of stony ground, and the patches of saltbush are very short and small, and the patches of stony ground in between are rather long, particularly when you compare them to the picture on the right, and the flags show you the distances between those of those different elements in the landscape. So the landscape on the left is much more leaky than the landscape on the right. Now going to slide 13, which shows a generalised picture of any transect or any grad sect we're looking at. We start upslope and we traverse downslope, and we identify the different sorts of patches that we see, and I've illustrated there shrubs, grasses, trees, and woody debris. And in between are what we call interpatches. Now we make a complete map of the patches and interpatches along that line. So we're going to identify the proportion of each of one of those patch types as we go along. We also measure how wide the patches are. So a wider patch across the contour of the landscape will clearly tend to trap more resources than very narrow or small patches. And all of these data are recorded in a spreadsheet. Now going on to the next slide, slide 15, which shows the list of 11 soil surface indicators I mentioned a bit earlier. Now, these are all characterised in the methodology, and each one reflects a process which was originally identified in the Trigger Transfer Reserve Pulse framework I explained earlier. This can all be done in the field. You can, I did most of my recording on paper, but these days you can carry a laptop with you in the field. It can enter the data directly into the spreadsheets. The other thing this diagram explains is how we reassign those individual indicators to generate 3 new emergent indices of landscape function. That is the stability or resistance to erosion, and the higher the number, the more stable the landscape. Secondly, the infiltration rate that we can discern from that landscape. And again, the higher the number, the greater will be the infiltration of rainfall. And finally, the nutrient cycling index, again, which reflects the efficiency at which nutrients in the system are recycled back to within the soil for reuse. Now, the indicators are compiled by equations in the spreadsheet, and they're all scaled from 0 to 100. But to be fair, it's almost impossible to score either 0 or 100, but it does enable the operator to be able to locate this landscape in a very large numerical scale. I'm going now to slide 15, and this is a list of the biophysical processes evaluated by the indicators. I won't read them out. People can read these at their leisure, but one to point out, which might not be obvious in its meaning, is saltation. This has got nothing to do with salt. It's a reflection of the way sand particles are blown around the system. They tend to bounce along in small trajectories. Often they don't go very far, but that process is called saltation. And that would be one of the things we would observe in collecting our basic data. I'm now going to slide 16, which shows a close-up of a soil which has been sampled from a perennial grassland with very little in the way of disturbance. You can see the soil fabric is very open and airy, and the aggregates are nicely spaced out together. And on the right-hand side, in the purple numbers, I've compiled the values for stability, infiltration, and nutrient cycling. You can keep those numbers in your minds: about 70, about 40, and about 32. In the same paddock, going to slide 17, we identified this soil which had been frequently trampled by cattle. And you can see that this now has a soil physical crust on top, got a very compact horizon, and you can see the numerical indicators we saw in the previous slide have all decreased very considerably. Now, the other thing to say, that these indicators do not necessarily march in lockstep together. Although all of those indicators have decreased, they have not decreased by the same proportion. So although we use the same 11 indicators, the fact that we've organised them in different combinations means that we can discriminate the strengths and weaknesses of any given soil. Going now to slide 18, that's assuming that we've been able to get some LFA data from our site. How do we use it to design and implement landscape restoration? Well, what we contend is that this restoration involves replacing or repairing deficient or defective biophysical processes which we've identified. And I contend that this will always be more successful than the hopeful scattering of seed of a desired species mix. I've seen many an example of that failing. Now, the next few slides, I'm going to illustrate the way we've gone about this. And the first one is an experiment using the principle of restoring missing processes in a degraded landscape. And the second, moving on from there, is a generalised approach about how to do it. I'm now going to slide 19, which shows our experiment looking directly down the slope of the land, which has actually got quite low slope, about 0.3%. It looks nearly flat, but in fact there is, because the soil is heavily crusted, the water runs off that quite easily. So what we did was to construct brush mounds in those plots you can see denoted by the white pegs. We made sure that the large woody part of the branches was in contact with the ground to arrest as much of any overland flow coming into there as possible. At the same time, the mounds were made 30 or 40 centimetres high so that they had a wind drag effect, which would capture any soil particles bounding across the surface and any litter, plant litter, which we could be blowing about. In the background, you can see another line of those treatments. And this picture was taken some months after our treatment was applied. You can see already there are new plants growing within our plot area. This is a view of the same trial, but looking down the line that is on the contour of our treatments. This is 7 years after we set it up. And what you can see there is the sort of vegetation response we got by making sure that all of the landscape processes had been replaced. And moreover, the quality of the soil within those plots had greatly improved. And I'll show you that in the next slide. But a point about this is there were no new resources applied to this experiment. Nothing from the outside at all, just a redistribution of the resources held somewhere within the landscape, but then concentrated into areas so that the plants could make the best use of them. And I should say that almost every species you can see there is a palatable local species, very valuable in terms of the grazing industry. In between the plot in the foreground and one further along, you can see two control plots which have had no treatment whatsoever applied to them, and there's no difference in those control plots. They have not done any better during the 7 years. I'm now going on to slide 21, which is a table of data. And I've listed on the left-hand column various properties which we measured. And in the middle column, I've said this is a plot where our branches were applied, and the right-hand plot was where we did not have any branches. And what this shows in soil surface elevation shows that where we had branches, in 3 years, we gained nearly 2 millimetres of soil, whereas our controls lost 2.7 millimetres of soil. The nitrogen and carbon were much higher under the branch mounds than under the controls. You can see the difference there. The infiltration rate was up to 118 millimetres per hour under our branch mound, but only 11.6 in our controls. And I can tell you from having studied the rainfall rates on this area from a large supply of Bureau of Meteorology data, this infiltration rate exceeds most natural rainfalls. We've now established plots which can absorb almost any rainfall which comes along. A soil respiration rate might be unfamiliar to some people, but this is measuring the biological activity of organisms living within the soil. These could be roots, they could be fungi, there could be soil fauna, microfauna. And you can see there's a substantial difference between the branch mounds and the branches. Quite by chance, in monitoring these sites, I noticed that there were many more ants present in our branch mounds, about 4 times as many ants. So the ants were finding prey in the experimental areas, whereas they were not finding any in the controls. I'd now like to move on in slide 22 to a 5-step process for going about rehabilitation. In the green cloud, there's all of the reasons you might want to have for doing rehabilitation. And I mightn't have every single one down, but I've seen all of these in action. So step one is to articulate what it is you want to achieve by rehabilitating. So that means goals for how that landscape will be used and who is going to be doing it. So that becomes a quite formal process. You need to go through the business of saying what it is you want to do. The second step is to go out and use an LFA and look at the site functionality and the limitations that are present. It's important for you to be able to define the causes of the problem, which you'll find by examining the indicators I mentioned, not just a list of symptoms. The reference site selection is important. You need to be able to find a site close by which is as good as you can find to act as some sort of reference. The third step is to identify which biophysical processes have to be initiated, and there may well be a priority list of this must be done first, this must be done later. So if you make a list of those things, and on troublesome landscapes such as mines, you might need to deal with acid mine drainage or hypersalinity first before you start trying to do any reseeding. Only when that's finished can you select and apply the appropriate rehabilitation technology, which could involve all sorts of either major or minor earthworks as well as a seed supply. The fifth step is to commence monitoring immediately. LFA is a procedure which can be used straight away, so you can promptly evaluate trend and response dynamics in relation to your goals. One of the things about LFA is you do get the results of your analysis on the day of collection. So we're now going to look at two possible outcomes of the monitoring. Is the trend okay or not? So looking at first at trends not okay. This means you have to go through an adaptive learning process. Do you have to revise the goals? Have you made your goals too adventurous, too difficult, almost impossible perhaps? Or perhaps was the technology selected not the right one, or was it not done very well? So this is something you need to go through there and then go around the loop again and improve what you've done. On the other hand, if the early monitoring suggests that trends are okay, you simply continue to monitor until finally you get to that very happy position where the objectives are met and you can get sign-off or satisfactory management of the rehabilitated landscape. I'm now going to go to the next slide, slide 23. Question is, how do you tell when you've done enough rehabilitation? The perennial question you hear from the backseat in a car trip, are we there yet? Because LFA is an indicator-based monitoring procedure intended for repeated use, it's possible to produce a time sequence of the changing function. So you would plot out time on the x-axis with function on the y-axis, and you would treat each of the stability, infiltration, and nutrient cycling indices separately. Typically, in non-tropical applications, a yearly review is at about the right interval. You don't need to give the system time to respond to wet and dry periods in order to see some changes. But in the wet tropics, I've seen major changes happening in a matter of weeks, and things can either improve or get worse very quickly. Now, we have found that a particular curve shape fitted to the time series data I've just mentioned provides a useful record of landscape function and facilitates estimating a satisfactory endpoint. Now moving on to slide 24, which shows the pictures show a sequence of rehabilitation being done on a bauxite mine from early days, middling days, and near the end where this extremely satisfactory rehabilitation. In the plot I've shown there's an S-shaped curve. So down towards the bottom where you see the letters Y North, that represents where you've started. And the top of the curve where it flattens right out is called Y Naught plus A. And that represents as good as that landscape can be with that soil type and in that climate. Then there'll be unique values for every landscape type and climate type you go to. There's a blob in the middle of that S, which I've called X naught B. You don't need to worry about that. But that's what I call the threshold of potential concern. So if you are climbing up from in the rehabilitation and you reach that point, you know that it's very likely that you're going to be successful and the site is on a trajectory to being a satisfactory sign-off condition. So if there would be milestones along there, which that dot in the middle of the curve is a major milestone. Going now to slide 25, we can also use LFA to record what goes wrong in a managed landscape where degradation is the major process and the curve turns around the other way. So I've shown pictures there of a landscape in particularly high functional condition, one in a moderate condition near that threshold of potential concern, and finally one where the landscape shows signs of considerable gully erosion, which is not where you want to be at all. And the numbers I've assigned to the curve simply show you the sorts of locations that LFA might place you in as your monitoring proceeds. So if you start at location 1 and you come down to location 2 to 3 and heading towards 4, the LFA values will tell you this is becoming a critical time to do rehabilitation. Do not wait until you get to position 6. So there's a lot of information or value in the LFA procedure. Turning now to slide 26. The other potential uses of LF data are to deal with rare but influential events, and we've recently seen major fires. There have been floods, there are windstorms, and interesting grazing drought interactions. So we want to find, we would use LFA to look at the magnitude of a sudden rare event. And you need to find out, is the landscape function assessment telling you that things are worse or better than they look from a casual glance? You may recall that after the fires last year, many people talked, particularly in the media, talked about landscapes being totally destroyed by fire. But an LFA would have shown there was considerable function still remaining in those landscapes. And over the next few years, we will be able to observe that appearing. The second point, kind of related to that one I've just mentioned, is you can look for resilient behaviour. That is a landscape bouncing back by itself after a major disturbance. And it will look for early indicators of returning to the pre-event situation in terms of function, which could be quite subtle if you only look at for a particular plant and before major rehabilitation is evident. So it does provide you with early warnings of rehabilitation. Now, slide 27 enumerates a sort of systems where LFA is not likely to be useful. And they are ones where have a very high management by user inputs, such as planted perennial pasture systems with fertiliser and irrigation, where the manager is in fact providing all of the scarce vital resources to make things work very well. Also, croplands which are frequently ploughed and reseeded and so on, even with annual crops. LFA does not give you a predictive understanding of what will happen there. And finally, horticultural systems growing vegetables in the ground or in glass houses, LFA doesn't give you much information about those sort of systems either. Turning now to my last slide is a picture of the book that my colleague John Ludwig and I published 10 years ago now, under the aegis of the Society for Ecological Restoration, and showing some information there about how you can obtain more information about LFA. And the group of people there are from all over the world. They'd attended an international mine rehabilitation conference, and we were explaining to them how we could use LFA in a game park to examine what had happened as a result of the fire. So I've provided the organisers with a fair bit of auxiliary information to support this talk, and anyone is welcome to take copies of that, make use of it, and contact me by email if you want further elucidation. Thank you, and that's the end of the presentation.
Okay, so that was Dr. David Tongway's keynote presentation. Like I said, he will be joining us in a few minutes, maybe half an hour after Jon Fawcett's presentation, to answer some questions. So stick around for that. But now I'll just hand back to Sophie to introduce our next speaker, Jon.
Thanks, Sasha. So next we're going to hear from Jon Fawcett, Dr. Jon Fawcett. John's a hydrogeologist with 20 years experience in the field of hydrogeology and soil water landscape studies related to salinity, soil water dynamics, groundwater dependent ecosystems, and groundwater resource assessments. John's expertise resides in combining knowledge of how groundwater systems and the water requirements of ecosystems interact. Jon was involved in nationally significant foundation projects regarding groundwater dependent ecosystems, the National Atlas of Groundwater Dependent Ecosystems, which is available on the BOM website, and was the technical lead in the Surat CMA Baseline Springs Monitoring Program, and worked as a senior research hydrologist at DPI for 8 years, and researched groundwater and surface water interaction dynamics via projects related to dryland salinity, salt mobilisation, and catchment water balance processes. So we'll hand over to Jon now to present the presentation he's put together for this event, Monitoring Hydrological and Subsoil Dynamics.
Cheers. So I assume I just share my screen.
Yep, you should have the ability to share your screen, Jon. Yep, we got it. Perfect.
Cool. And you can hear me okay?
Yep, coming through loud and clear.
So look, thank you for doing this presentation. Trying to build on from what David's been talking about, but also trying to talk about a little bit more about stuff underneath our feet, and also, you know, how we can sort of measure it. I'm a hydrogeologist at a company called CDM Smith, but I've got a longer past than that. One of the things about measurement of change and landscape restoration, you know, David's provided a description of the overall approach, his experience, you know, other than visual inspections. You know, how can we sort of look at David's work and say, yes, it works, we've got some data to demonstrate that it, you know, through time it really changes the landscape. And I've got in bold there one point, which is, you know, we're not reinventing the wheel here. There's an extraordinary amount of information out there around stream flow, erosion, soils. You know, there's a wealth of information that we can go to understand how these, you know, passive landscape controls, rehabilitation actually take place. Which I'll go through some examples. Just a little bit about myself, just because this is something I'm passionate about. Paul Foreman, who's an organiser of this, we live, you know, a stone throw away from each other near Castlemaine. We live on landscape. I grew up on a really big farm as a kid. I was a geologist by trade years ago. As Sophie said, I worked at DPI for 8 years in the Centre for Land Protection, and I think you'll hear this comment a lot. You know, government departments really quite ramped up years ago around land protection, and that's changed through time, unfortunately, and that knowledge is, you know, sort of left the department in many places. I've been a consultant for 20 odd years working around Australia, and where I live, if any bird watchers there, just because just recently I counted 24 species of bird that nest on my block. And it's actually a privilege to speak after David. I actually attended a course that David gave 24 years ago, whether he remembers or not, and I've actually had honours students and have actually applied his approach in the field, and it works. So it's actually a bit of a privilege to speak with David. I want to revisit some local examples of degradation at a place called Walmer, which is in between Maldon and Castlemaine in central Victoria. It's just the road that you know, Paul and I drive along. Look at some solutions. I see what are some of the implementations to try and control the degradation or return the restoration to landscape function, and look at some evidence of change. How do we know through time that what we're doing actually gives us the results that we want? And I'm not really going to focus on the trees or the grasses or the farming management. I'm going to try and focus on well, I will focus on the subsoil. If we step back to look at some principles, and you know, David sort of covered these, but I think it's a good way to consider that degradation as, you know, it's a change in energy. It's about entropy. You know, basically we've really sped up the hydrology in our landscape, and that has implications to biological. If we consider the diagram on the left, you know, we in a really simplistic term, good conditions where we have an uplands environment. You know, we've got groundwater. The groundwater should be a subtle reflection of the topography, as in it should be a little bit higher underneath the hills than it is down in the streams, and we have rainfall. And we have groundwater recharge. What's really important is the flow between the surface and the groundwater, the interflow. This is that infiltration that David was talking about. This is a really important sponge. It's a really important part of what we're going to be talking about. In our poor conditions, it's, you know, we clear the landscape, we compact it, whatever that may be. In these upland settings, you know, we really accelerate overland flow. We get our erosion and flooding, which I'll talk about, you know. So we have you know, a much smoother landscape, but the overland flow increases. We decrease infiltration, and we're out of balance. And the conversation is about how do you go back, how do you go from B to A in a hydrological sense. Just reiterating this concept of energy, because I think it's very important, and I'm sure there's a lot of people who are going to be talking this afternoon that have actually put a lot of these things into practice and can see it, but kind of stole this diagram from an erosion manual, actually. And I like it because on the left-hand side, if you consider the diagram, we've got a slope, and we've got, if you look at that in plan view, you know, we've got a redistributed energy. Our vectors of energy and water flow are spread across. What occurred very quickly when we had the clearing and erosion events, and especially in central Victoria, the gold mining, the sluicing, is that we interrupted this distributed energy system, and we actually focus all the energy right into the guts of these little gullies, and they actually then head cut forward up gradient. And we've got to try and shift that energy back around. And if you can't shift that energy, you're not going to be able to, you know, in a hydrological sense, actually start seeing landscape restoration. This is a road nearby where we live. Thanks to Paul for the photo. I like this photo. It illustrates some points of what we're talking about around energy and water flow and how the system's responding. It's obviously the same spot. The photo on the left is you know, after a rain, and you can see that all the water's just, you know, channeled straight down to the, you know, the floor of the little gully erosion. And then on the right, it's during summer and it's dry. The key points about this, which I'm going to come to, is that we've probably got, it might be a metre of alluvium here. It's not a huge alluvium deposit, but there is a metre of material here that's actually dried out. It's exposed and it's eroding. You know, the trees have obviously got, you know, not a hell of a lot of stability. And the grasses there, I'm not a grass expert, but, you know, they're exotic, they're annuals, and during summer periods, you know, they're not providing that root stability at all. So that's the, an example of the local degradation, and probably an example of around Central Victoria, the problem that we face, and other places, obviously. So another photo that I'll come back to some points about it, about an eroding landscape, that exposed roots. But what I really want to show is this hard pan, these lines you can see in the top of the gully. And David showed a nice photo of a clump of soil that has that, and it's very, very low in permeability, very, very low infiltration, and it's all very dry. So these are the landscapes that we're looking at for some of the processes. So simple solutions, bit of surface water management. How can we see the impact of these solutions? I'm just going to look at really simple surface water management, look at changes in subsoil and groundwater, look at what happens if you change the soil infiltration from a site down near Hamilton, and carbon and soil respiration and bugs. And I think a lot of this is about bugs. It's about fungus. It's about the really small things within soil, and how can we see that these approaches have worked. I'll keep on moving through that slide, just reiterating. This is a photo from my property. It's an unnamed creek, but we moved there about 15 years ago. And the photo on the left was only taken this year, but there's a log that was felled. I dropped it into the creek. I'm looking upstream, so in this photo, and what occurred, and I didn't plan to do this, by the way, it just happened inadvertently, is we've got, previous to this, if I had a photo, it would be a simple gouged out stream, and the logs dropped and it's accumulated all this sediment, and I know that's spiny rush, but it's still some form of vegetation growth upstream. And in the photo on the right, I'm actually looking, the log you just can't quite see, but you're actually standing in an area that it is moist, but it's really, really stable, and the erosion of that creek is actually quite reduced, and water does flow underneath the log, but it's a little passive way of doing it. Coming back to the importance of energy, and doing things the right way, this is an example of what not to do. And this has happened before we brought the property about 15 years ago. What somebody had done with a massive truck, and you can see here, these are massive quartz boulders, actually from the Store gold mine, and they must have put tons and tons in through here. So the stream used to sort of run through here. What's occurred, and it's still accelerating, and I still have to do something about it, is the stream flowing this way actually just went straight around the boulders, and it is completely eating through the side of the stream, because large impermeable barriers, they butt up against the energy of the flowing stream. It's an ephemeral stream, and it just exacerbates it. So in terms of the control measures, we've got to consider that energy and get that energy flow right. I'll come back to an issue. This has occurred in a groundwater system in Queensland as an example. It's just like you have less riparian vegetation, you will have more erosion and flooding. And when you look at the literature, the MurrayDarling Basin, paired catchment trials, there's a heap of information around about the impact of a cleared catchment versus a vegetated catchment in terms of the energy flow, in terms of the surface water flow. And just, very simply, the diagram on the left, I found it just has its axis going up is discharge rate or volume, and then we have time. And as, basically the peak here, low roughness, as in this peak comes from a catchment that's cleared or burnt, and you have very high flow, and then you have receding limb that's very, very quick. The roughness, which is vegetation management, more vegetation, dampens out the peak of the flow, and you have flow duration for longer. So we get that, but and that's the principle. What we're trying to do is slowing down the energy. I came across this cool little bit of work where they actually, I'd love to see anybody try and get away with this today. They actually burnt a subcatchment as a trial. And so this axis is the flow. They had stream water loggers working, so that's a millimetres an hour of discharge, and this is through time. And they ran the data, and then they burnt the catchment. which I think is a hilarious experiment. And then post the fire, they measured these peaks in flow, and it's just reiterating that point that, you know, riparian veg, you know, lowland vegetation or vegetation across the catchment and management of vegetation and erosion, you know, it's important to stop these peaks in the surface flow causing the erosion. One of the interesting projects we've been working on for several years is around an aquifer in Queensland, Debra, if people know the Pine River, which is the north, inland north of Brisbane. And the reason I brought this in as an example is that a lot of us who live in you know, the landscapes of Victoria, New South Wales, wherever, we look at erosion that's post the initial land clearing, that's post initial sludge from the gold mining, whatever it may be. And we know that the groundwater system may have changed because of that in our alluvial systems, but we didn't actually have any data on it because, you know, it was just, we look at the impact of the outcome of the landscape management as opposed to having data to look at it. But, you know, thank God for climate change. As a hydrogeologist and someone who works in water, one of the last 10 years have been the most incredible data sets. I think one of the things I said is my daughter, who's 14, has lived through 4 1-in-100-year events. So the data recently through climate change actually has given us some really amazing information about how sort of groundwater and surface water and these ecosystems or systems work. I'm just going to pose a little conceptual diagram, then I'm going to show some data about this aquifer. You know, slide 1 here, we're considering the fact that we're in a pre-erosion state. The little alluvial system is full of water. We've got a little bit of water flowing through it, and it's nice and stable. We induce our erosion down, which is number 2, and apart from scouring at the stream, it basically pulls the plug on the groundwater system and actually starts draining the alluvial system because groundwater flows downhill, and if you lower your base, therefore you lower your groundwater. Our goal and aim is that we restore this. We put some form of structure back into the little alluvial system, and just like that tree I was sort of showing you earlier. And the outcome is through time you actually resaturate the groundwater. You know, often groundwater to me is a bit of the poor cousin when it comes to a lot of landscape management. It's a thing that's out of mind, out of sight, but it's actually really important because that saturation in the alluvium really helps a lot of trees, especially the red gums, you know, that need that additional moisture. They've evolved to that additional moisture through dry periods. So that's the conceptualization of it. So what does some actual monitoring data look like? And I'll show that. So this is the Debra aquifer. So I've got sort of 2 more slides, and it's a small aquifer, so it's kind of the area of the trees through here, and the dots are groundwater observation ports, and they use this for the Debra water supply. What happened between 2009 and 2015, and this is the diagram to the right, is they had a whole heap of erosional events. And they compared 2 digital elevation models, and so what you're looking at is a difference between some periods. And the red areas, there were up to 7 meters, gouging of the stream. There was deposition through this period. So, but it's kind of replicating what could have occurred 100 years ago in some landscapes from the gold mining, a seriously large erosion event within a small river system that's got trees and it's got an aquifer. The beauty was we've actually got some data before the gouging event or the stream erosion event and post. And I'll just bear with me a bit on this slide. It's a bit messy and there's a fair bit to talk about it, but 1998, it is the time period to 2017. To have groundwater data before and after events is really rare, significant events. So this is, for me, it's actually pretty cool. The blue line is the river level, so that's the river height, and the orange is the groundwater level right beside the river in the alluvium. And if we look at the pre-flooding period, you see that the groundwater and the stream, the river actually function together. They almost cooperate with each other. They're kind of, and I'll say they're within balance. They've reached an equilibrium between in and out of the system. The red lines, 2009, 11, 12, 13, that's when we had these, or that area had the flood and scouring events, and then we have the post-flood period. What's really evident is because we dropped the layer of the river and we started draining the landscape, so it's an eroding event, and just like what occurred in nearly every single drainage line 100, 150 years ago, we no longer have the same relationship between the river and the groundwater. Just shifted. So the system's kind of out of balance. And as well as that, you know, we've actually lost a whole heap of storage. So the average groundwater levels with the top line, and now we're sort of heading down lower. So it's actually, not only has it impacted what visually how the stream would look with the erosion, but it's actually dropped the amount of moisture within that alluvial system, you know, by several metres. So it's just a really good example of how the groundwater systems and alluvial systems change through erosion, and also principally if from, you know, going forward, we actually want to turn back to this period here. A little bit about ripping. I think that's Paul's place again. I'm sure everybody on this phone call has done some ripping, but you run a tractor and you rip it and you plant trees and things work well. What do we know about how that impacts the subsoil over time in terms of infiltration and drainage? I'm going to direct you to a project that I did back in 2004, where we actually compared treated, it was a whole heap of degradation down near Balmoral, Hamilton, down in Victoria, and areas were ripped and revegetated and areas weren't. So the control areas here were bare, barren, degraded. You've got a crust and then you've got the trees through here. Sorry for the image. I actually don't have an electronic version of this report anymore, and it's an old printout sort of copy, so it's not the best quality, but that's our control. Sorry, that's our control here, and that's the trees. So we went through and collected a whole bit of soil cores, hundreds of soil cores actually across a whole area. And what we did with the soil cores was down to about 1.20 meters, every 5 centimetres, we looked at the salinity profile. So the red line, so we've got soil depth on the axis, and we've got salinity, so it's in decisiemens, so it's getting pretty salty, and that's representing the control plot here. The feature to look at is the fact that we've got really high salinity in the topsoil because there's no infiltration, any rainfall or any discharge, anything's just concentrating on there. And this very straight salinity down here, this, you know, it's so constant is because there's very little subsoil water movement going on. It's kind of separated from the surface. When we look at the revegetated plots, and this is 10 years later, so the trees are 10 years old, and we look at the average soil salinity profile, we get a really, really different profile. The surface salinity's dropped dramatically, but we've got an increase in the salinity from about 40 to 80 centimetres deep. And for that to occur, what we're proving is that, you know, a 20, 30 centimetre ripping process in some trees in 10 years has actually enabled water movement, infiltration, probably down to about 1 metre. So that in 10 years, we've been able to get more air, more water, more organic matter deeper down into a degraded landscape, simply through ripping and planting trees. And we've got data that illustrates that. And David had, you know, the change in the surface infiltration. Well, we would have change in subsurface permeability going on here to drive this through. So it was a good bit of evidence around the impact of surface management on subsurface processes. Another thing that when I had students looking at land degradation, this wasn't one of my students, but I've come across it, was the question that if you have really degraded landscapes, you know, do you have do you still have the microbiological activity? Do you still have the fungus there that if you do something to it, will you see the response? You know, David's work in those arid areas sort of illustrates that. I'm going to sort of show a couple of slides on a controlled experiment from a PhD, Vanessa Wong's PhD, where they took soil samples and they from really, and I'll show you, so really degraded soils, and they actually added organic matter. In this case, it was actually brown wallaby grass and a little bit of gypsum. And in a controlled experiment, we measured soil respiration over time. So in terms of the landscape, the photo there, you can see, you know, it needs a bit of love, that landscape. It's you know, bare, and Vanessa took the samples from the degraded areas and took them to a lab. And this is a soil respiration chamber. And which we're, in terms of the BioLinks program, we've, you know, Paul Foreman's actually built some of these that are going in the field. But what you do is, this is a soda lime. It's got sodium or calcium mixture in it, and this is the soil, and it's been dosed with the wallaby grass and gypsum. And the change in salinity of that liquid is a reflection of the CO2 respiration coming out of the soil within a closed chamber. And the data has an accumulation of the CO2 on that scale and weeks. And so this is a 12-week period in the lab. And I know it's a controlled experiment, and soils were from 5 centimetres and 10 centimetres. But it was just a nice example that if, you know, given any love and tenderness to a landscape or a degraded soil, the soil bugs are actually still there. And this landscape would have got pretty hot. So, and this shows a change in respiration for time in a completely controlled experiment. And it sort of shows that if you do something, the bugs and the cell respiration will follow coming forward. And it was just a neat bit of work to illustrate, you know, that, you know, if we get more organic matter into our soils, we will get more soil respiration. And I'll continue a little bit more with the, you know, the importance of organic matter. I've got sort of a couple more slides to go. The other real critical part of organic matter is that at different scales, organic matter, living and dead, at the micro scale, actually binds clay together. So the photo there is just showing sodic soil. It's got water, and you've got suspended solids, dissolved solids in it, and that's because there's an imbalance in the organic matter in the soil upstream. And there's a fair bit of literature around this, that at different levels, at different scales, different sizes of organic matter actually, they're like a binding agent as well as the light that actually makes your soil less erodible at the micro scale. And during my PhD, we actually got into this a bit, and I can show you a groovy SEM photo just to start finishing off. And this is a scanning electron microscope photo of a soil, and we've got it's a ferrihydrite, which we've got some different iron minerals and different clay particles. And what we've got here is things called diatoms. And when you look at how they function at a micro scale, they're kind of gluing it together, but they're a bit like staples. They actually bind everything together, you know, at that scale, because they're you know, and therefore, as David showed that example, that soil pod that had, you know, soil groups kind of holding together, not all compacted together, it's because of that combination with the organic matter within the soil. So it's an important part of that landscape restoration, apart from providing CO2 or the, you know, the carbon stocks. The carbon, you know, the microbacteria actually hold the soil together. So for just my last slide around it, in summary, sort of summarising, is that, you know, landscape restoration, you know, will reduce erosion. It will change stream dynamics. We know that, and we also know that landscape restoration, even at the size or the scale of the photo to the right, we can actually enhance the rehydration of the shallow groundwater systems, and we've got sort of evidence for that. We know with deep ripping and planting that through time, that really does increase soil infiltration, you know, down 10, 20, 30 centimetres down to a metre within landscapes. And we know that can actually help balance the soil chemistry, as in, you know, stop having quite concentrated areas of salt. We also know that if you introduce any form of organic matter, not any form, but the local forms of organic matter, you will increase soil respiration. And even really, no matter how degraded the landscape actually is. And, you know, that organic matter is actually, you know, the building blocks of the stabilisation of the entire soil structure. I think I'll leave it at that, Soph. And I'll stop sharing, I assume. So,
Thank you. Yeah, you can just click stop sharing. It's just like a red button.
oh, there, right in front of me.
Yeah, perfect. Thank you so much, John. Okay, so we are heading now into our Q&A section. So we've got about 20 minutes for people to ask questions. I haven't noticed any come through on the chat, but that's okay. We can get the ball rolling ourselves. We should have Dr. David Tongway joining us via phone as well. So as soon as he's connected, I'll let you know that he's available for questions. But please pop a question in the chat or turn your microphone on now if you would like to ask John a question.
Oh, sorry, Louise from England. I wanted to, I really address it to both speakers. I mean, what is the importance of lowering stocking rates in terms of improving soil? So if you have an area that's been heavily grazed or where they've overstocked, I mean, if you bring it back to very, very low stocking rates, I mean, how does that affect soil hydrology and soil quality? I mean, have you done, I did ag science myself, and I remember doing some experiments, but so many years ago, but I just wondered how, I mean, as a step one, would say if you bought some land that was very badly overstocked, step one would be to back off completely with stocking rates, so reduce them dramatically. And I just wondered how much that would improve the soil quality, if at all.
Thanks, Louise. I'm not an agronomist, and I did grow up on a sheep farm, but I didn't want to be a fourth generation farmer, so I left. One of the interesting things about the family farm now, in terms of stocking rates, and there's a lot of people I'm sure on this call that knows more about this than I, that in the family farm, which is now biodynamic, they actually have incredibly intensive stocking rates for extremely short periods of time. And they have a big rest period afterwards.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
It's about root growth, you know, and the dumping of the organic matter, and then leave. That's our farm, and that's our soil, and I'm sure that that's different in different places, you know, and I think, as David said, different landscapes have it. I'm pretty sure. So from Paul, there's some part of the speakers coming up will probably reflect on that more. You know, but any kind of, if the intensive stocking is accompanied by really rapid grass growth, I don't think it's so bad. If intensive stocking is accompanied by a bare area, I think it's really, really bad.
Yeah, okay, no, thank you.
Thank you so much for your question. So I believe we have Dr. Tongway. Are you here? Can you hear us?
Yes, I can hear. Yes, I can hear you.
Oh, fantastic. Thank you so much for joining us. So everyone has seen your keynote presentation, and I'm sure they all loved it. And we've also just heard from Dr. Jon Fawcett as well. So while we have David Tongway here, does anyone have any questions that are directed for him? Please let us know.
I have a question. Susan Heyman.
Go for it, Susan.
David, we have property in central Victoria, and we have some quite bare slopes surrounded by perennial grasses. On those bare slopes, we have put a number of those brush mounds, and we found that in the first year, it's definitely slowed the water, but we have had quite a big regrowth of things like capeweed and the annual grasses. And we were wondering whether it's better to have those there slowing the water, and maybe in a few years plant other indigenous vegetation, and whether the weeds are actually doing a beneficial job there.
Yes, it's likely that the weeds are doing a beneficial job. as long as you're seeing resources being trapped by your branch mounds, I think you're heading in the right direction. But you might speed things up a bit by adding a little bit of seed for the species you're interested in those patches, which seem to be doing quite well.
Thank you very much. We'll try that definitely.
Thank you, Susan. I have a question for you, David Tongway, from Fiona from Mallee Conservation. She asks, in low rainfall of 250 millimetres per acre, do we retain plant cover even if it is weedy annuals, or do remove weeds to encourage native perennials via spraying and burning, which exposes the soil?
I think I'm not ever would ever encourage people to expose bare soil, because that means that whenever you get a rainfall event, the rain falls directly on the soil surface and it's inclined to form a physical crust. This slows down the infiltration rate and increases runoff, which might encourage erosion. So if you've got a system where you've only got annuals, it's probably better to try and seed into or plant vegetation into the annual plant patches.
Okay, perfect. Thank you, David. Hopefully that answers your question, Fiona. There was another question for you, David, from Jennifer Rowland. She asks, could you tell us more about how you constructed and secured the brush packs?
Okay. First thing is I've always tried to have the woody parts of the brush packs comprised of branches or pieces of wood at least 2 inches or 50 millimetres in diameter, and have them in direct contact with the ground so that they intercept any overland flow which comes through. Usually this means that they're heavy enough to withstand a heavy overland flow which might come through, but not so heavy that you can't actually manipulate them onto the site. We also made the branch mounds about 30 centimetres high or a foot high, so that they have some aerodynamic drag for anything which blows around. So any dust or sand particles or seeds or organic matter will also be collected in the branch mound. So if you've got access to branches which you can use, just the weight of the branches themselves will do the job. But here in Canberra, we've been using on our nature parks Koya logs, which is really coconut fibre rolled up into a log, about 2.5 metres long and about 20 centimetres in diameter. And we've used those to create a new obstruction, and we hold them in place with red gum stakes driven right through the log, so that it holds it well in place. We have trouble with kangaroos wanting to pull these things apart, so we have to hold them in place with stakes.
Okay, great, thank you. Another one for you, David. We've got a couple more for you, David. Dani asks, could landscape function analysis be used as monitoring technique in parks management, where we are undertaking activities to reduce total grazing pressure of pests and native grazers? For example, mallee, semi-arid woodlands.
Yeah, it's ideal. That's the sort of circumstance that was originally developed for the use in the first application of LFA was done by the Western Australian Department of Agriculture in their rangelands, and they established a couple of thousand LFA transects in the mid-1990s to do these sorts of things. So it is intended to be used as a monitoring procedure, either to watch what happens when you change perhaps just the grazing regime, or also to monitor any treatments you've applied in order to rapidly increase the trapping capacity of a system you're developing.
Okay. And then another one, this is from our very own Paul Foreman for David. Is LFA equally applicable to degraded areas within temperate zones? And why don't many degraded landscapes, including bushland, recover even when the original disturbance ceases?
Well, I've deployed the LFA procedure from the driest deserts, for example, in Western Namibia, right up to the highlands of New Guinea with 10 to 15 metres of rain. So it's applicable to almost any landscape which is not a highly managed one, for example, like perennial pastureland or a cropland. So it's very hard to answer why this questioner's system does not seem to work. But what I've always suggest to people is they find a piece of landscape similar to their degraded landscape to use as a model to simulate in terms of function. So, for example, in a perennial native grassland, you'll find that there are a large number of grass tussocks fairly closely spaced, which means that there's a large number of small, individually not very effective, but collectively quite effective resource regulators. Whereas in a woodland, you'll find a smaller number of larger patch types to try to emulate. So the best thing is to try and simulate or reconstruct the scale at which resources are distributed across the landscape.
Okay, perfect. Thank you so much, David. We're going to ask Jon Fawcett a couple of questions now. John, David Feith asks, we have a property at Resdale. We have 2 areas of erosion gullies developing on 60-metre steep slopes down to the Campaspe and Stone Jug Creek. Any suggestions for erosion management, please?
I'd love to see a photo to answer that properly, but if you're Reedsdale, I assume you're on the granites there. I'm not sure, or the basalts, but it's the velocity again. And I assume if you've got gullies cutting out, you've got to slow the water. I don't know what the farm looks like, whether it's vegetated or it's cleared, but along the banks, you've got to start slowing the slopes. You've got to start slowing the water first, which is around that deep ripping, and then there'll be vegetation. And I think Paul Foreman's going to talk sort of an example about this at Heathcote, where you've got to combine your slope with your in drainage controls of the water flow. You can't, that example that on my property, you can't just put a big group of boulders in the creek, it just erodes around it. You've got to sort of start the control further up slope. So if it is severe degradation going into the, cutting through, going down into the river, you've probably got a velocity issue, and would have to be a whole sort of subcatchment approach. The experience I've seen is that as soon as you only do it in the creek or the drainage line, the energy just keeps on going over it because you've got all the movement from the slopes coming in. But it'd be good to see a photo to have a look at it for sure.
Oh, could I send you a photo, or how could I share something with you?
Yeah, you can send my details are with biolinks. More than I'm on a day like this, it'd be lovely to go for a drive out to the Campaspe. I assume the Campaspe is flowing quite well.
Campaspe is doing well at the moment.
Yes,
very well.
I bet it is. But yeah, I think I think Paul Foreman might be talking a little bit about the broader landscape sort of controls, and some of it. I think you might learn a little bit more today.
Great.
From some people that have actually really put this into practice.
I really liked your picture. It was of a gully erosion, but that started us thinking of how we could try and manage these areas, because they've been a bit of a worry to us as to where to start.
Yeah, don't get a big truckload of rocks. That's the first thing.
No, that was good to see, and we wouldn't have started with that anyway, I don't think. But thank you very much. Thanks for that, and I'll look forward to this afternoon then.
Thank you so much.
Could
for your
I add
question.
a little bit?
Oh, yeah, go, David, please.
I'd agree with what the previous speaker said. I've watched the improvement of very severe gully erosion in Central Australia, and the principle is to try and starve the gully of run-in water. So that means starting your rehabilitation upslope of the gully and try and restrict the amount of water flowing into it.
Okay, that's really good advice. That's
Yeah, it's that diagram of the energy I showed earlier.
yes.
You've got to spread your energy out. If you don't spread your energy out, you're just going to cause another problem somewhere else.
Okay, that's excellent. Thank you very much. Thanks, both of you.
Thank you for your question. We probably have time for one more question. Bert, I can see that you've got your hand up. Did you want to turn your microphone on and ask your question?
Yeah, thanks. A question for Jon. Just thinking about largely cleared catchments and, you know, the whole idea of energy, in-stream energy. I'm just wondering, so much of Victoria is cleared and, you know, has a plethora of small farm dams, which can have negative consequences for stream flow and so on. But in listening to you, I'm also thinking that they actually slow down flow artificially as well. Have you got any thoughts on the sort of cost benefits there of small farm dams?
It's a great question, because when I was back at the department with Lake Eppalock, farm dams had a really bad name because it's actually about water for irrigators or towns downstream. So if you know, farm dams are really impactful when it's dry or when it's really, you know, kind of in the middle. But I think farm dams are undervalued. When I look around, if you have streams that are degraded down to a rock, down to bedrock, it's like Muckleford Valley is, they don't hold any water. If you don't have farm dams, there's actually no water within the landscape. And, you know, there are red belly snakes, the turtles, the birds. We occasionally get a spoonbill on our dams. I'm not saying we need to get rid of some, you know, there might be too many dams, but currently as the landscape is, they have really important functions. They grab sediment, they can slow down the hydrology in terms of that energy. And, you know, they're also part of the broader ecosystem. I think in terms of drainage lines, people will always use this term, and if you read early explorers books, we talk about chain of ponds, where there was a series of very small dams that run down streams that hold water, as opposed to a completely gutted stream. So I think, and I've been wanting to get an honours and a PhD student on this, to actually have a look at the hydrological value of dams, but also the ecological value of farm dams, and actually try and bring it together, because sheep need to drink, they need water. So I've moved in my view of farm dams, and I see them far more positive than I would have 10, 15 years ago in terms of their role within the landscape. I think I've answered your question, but I think they're better than not. That makes sense.
Could I add a little bit to that?
Oh, great, thanks very much.
Yes, David, if you'd like to add something, go for it.
Yeah, yes, I agree with what the speaker has said. I would suggest what we're looking for here is the Goldilocks solution. Not too much, not too little. Before settlement, there were no dams at all, but the system had enough natural resource regulation to be able to control the rate of outflow. But now that we've changed the way those landscapes are used, we do need to have some regulation in place, and farm dams do provide or can provide that service to the system. It's a question of making them work in just the right way so that you collect some of the water for stock use and what have you, but also slow down the overall rate of loss of water from the landscape.
All right. Thank you so much, David Tongway and Jon Fawcett. we do need to wrap it up there, as we do have another session starting. Again, I want to thank you both so much for your presentations, and for everyone who came along and participated in the chat. I can see that we haven't quite gotten to everyone's questions, so we will take a note of those and try and get back to everyone with follow-ups on those questions after the symposium as well. So yes, I just want to say thank you so much to everyone who came along to this first session, and we'll be starting the next session in probably about 5 minutes. So I'm looking forward to seeing you there.
Thanks again.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure, and I'd be happy to respond to email questions.
Fantastic. And we do have all of your assets, which will be available to everyone as well, David. So I'll make sure that the people who want to get in contact with you can as well.
Good. Thank you.
No worries. Speak to you soon. Thanks, everyone.